Kia ora koto, Morena. Great to see everyone here after what seemed like a really fun night. So thank you for making the time to come to this conversation. Sorry. Is this better? Enna mana, enna reo, enna karangatanga maha, tena koto katoa. Te mana whenua o tene wahi, te iwi o Rangitane. Rangitane are the people of the land that I come from in Te Papaya at Massey. Tena koto o tira, ena iwi whanui, tena koto katoa. I acknowledge the Yagera and Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of this land and their connection to the ongoing struggles for decolonization. This conversation centers what it means to decolonize through a framework for justice when we explore questions of intercultural interactions and digital spaces, and any conversation on decolonization and justice must begin with acknowledging the ongoing struggles of the Palestinian people against an ongoing genocide and the people of Gaza in demonstrating what it is to build just futures and to struggle for that. So I tautuko, I honor that struggle, and I share some thoughts in relationship to, in connection with, in solidarity with the struggles of the Palestinian people. So what I will do in this conversation is outline some of the key tenets of the culture-centered approach that I have been working with, and I will foreground the work of the center that I direct that Jamie pointed out, the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, or CARE. CARE works with a large team, so really any work that is presented singularly is often the work of collectives that put together the concepts, the ideas, the theories, the practices. And in this context, we have about 50 plus community-led interventions that are led by community researchers and activists from around the globe. And we also have an activist in residence program at Massey that is hosted by CARE that brings in activists. They spend a week up to a month with us, delving on concepts around justice, developing white papers, policy briefs, and attempting to translate theory and concepts into action. It is also a way for us to recognize that the process of knowledge production itself is beyond the academy, beyond the towers and walls of the academy, and embedded in community and in struggles. So what I will do in this particular conversation is talk about the colonial roots of the ways in which we approach intercultural interactions. And I'm going to make a fairly critical argument that the concepts that we think through when conceptualizing intercultural interactions are embedded in whiteness, which is the hegemonic values of white culture that are upheld as universal. So from that point then, I will look at the ways in which we can conceptualize digital infrastructures, digital inequalities, and intercultural interactions, centering questions of power and its relationships to settler colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and cisnormativity. In that sense, I will argue that the Trump moment that we witness today is not an exception, it is not an anomaly, but it is an extension of the whiteness that is built into the hegemonic structures through which liberal democracies are organized. So I'm really glad that Jamie highlighted the work of the center that we do on democracy, which actually begins with a critique of liberal organizing of democracy within capitalist imperial structures, and fundamentally asks the question, what does it mean to build democracies in the Gandhian tradition that are rooted in a socialist politics, that are rooted in a politics of redistribution, that are rooted in a commitment to voice? So you will hear me talk quite a bit about a key tenet in my work, which is the concept of voice infrastructures. So I want to begin by a little bit of a broad overview of the history of the study of intercultural communication and really locate this history in US Cold War politics and the imperial infrastructure of the US and NATO alliances in that sense. situating this within the broader context of democracy promotion initiatives, often serving the interests of the US to promote the global free market. So when you think about the concept of culture as it appears within this dominant framework, is culture as a site of surveillance. So when you think about the earliest works of Mead and Bateson, for instance, in Indonesia, it was part of an imperial surveillance infrastructure that was surveilling the cultures of the global south so that they won't turn communist, or so that they won't turn socialist. And this also forms the backdrop then of the 1965 genocide that we witnessed in Indonesia, that came about through US backing, really, and through the kind of intelligence that was being fed into in terms of notions of what we understand as the ethnic, exotic culture to be configured into the infrastructures of the ways in which we develop knowledge, policies, and responses. So culture then, in this sense, is conceptualized as an essence that serves the infrastructures of racial capitalism. So the question to ask here is, who conceptualizes culture, for whose purposes, how is culture theorized, and then how is culture mobilized toward a particular kind of political economy? So the psychology of intercultural communication then has systematically been deployed to hold up the military, industrial, technological apparatus. So the question here, when we ask about this question of reform, it is worth asking, how can we reform a system that is fundamentally built upon serving the extractive agendas of racial capitalism and empire? A decolonizing reading would suggest that we fundamentally need to look at ways in which we can dismantle the basic apparatus through which we conceptualize culture, treat culture as an essence, but also theorize culture as an instrument in order to perpetuate both colonial and capitalist violence. So within this framework then, knowledge around culture has played a critical role in propping up repressive regimes and military infrastructures that have subverted community organizing around redistributive politics and anti-colonial struggles. So I am offering you here a conceptual argument that the hegemonic theorizing of culture actually has worked systematically to erase, even though it uses the language of participation and democracy, it has been co-opted in order to silence, and it has also systematically disenfranchised communities at the margins within indigenous contexts and within struggles of the global south. So embedded in this concept of culture, when I ask this question, who is theorizing culture, is the overarching value of whiteness, which is the hegemonic values of white culture that are upheld, recycled, and circulated as universal, so that the gaze of the culture is always elsewhere. So it is the white theorist that travels to the elsewhere to conceptualize, theorize, map, measure, empirically study culture. In my own discipline, in communication, I have made a critical argument that often when we talk about internationalizing the discipline, internationalizing communication, it is often sort of an architecture of further expanding the conceptual tenets of hegemonic white theories now tested empirically across global south spaces. So we can say that we have internationalized, or we can say we are now doing cross-cultural work. You can see superficial work that compares China and India and Sri Lanka, all in one study, by the way, and the US, all in one study based upon concepts that are fundamentally derived from the infrastructures of whiteness. So I argue that internationalization done uncritically actually upholds whiteness, upholds empire, rather than dismantling it. And the language of decolonization in this sense has fundamentally been co-opted, such that it can actually serve this very logic in order to expand the reach of hegemonic concepts. I will begin with a few concepts. Acculturation. Think about how we study acculturation in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It just amazes me. People come to study acculturation in New Zealand and they will talk about how Chinese students are adjusting to New Zealand culture without interrogating what is New Zealand culture. especially in a land that is founded on the principles of Tetiriti. Tetiriti is the foundational document that Maori signed as a contract with the British Crown. So when you're acculturating to New Zealand culture, are you acculturating to the mainstream Pakeha culture? Or are you acculturating to a culture that upholds and honors Te Tiriti, which is the foundational document of Aotearoa, and which would mean that you're acculturating to a fundamental understanding of communication that is decolonizing, that is imagining the world in values of aroha, love, manakitanga, mutuality and respect, whakawhanangatanga, connection with each other, rather than acculturating to a culture of individualism, competition, competitive movement. So it's really critical to think through when we conceptualize the basic ingredients of the acculturation process, for instance, from whose standpoint are we considering these stages or steps, the episodic movements from one stage to the other. And what does that kind of reductionism serve in terms of upholding the colonial structure? Similarly, the concept of cultural competence. Who defines competence? What are the basic tenets of competence? What are the basic tenets in terms of the broader infrastructure of racial capitalism and settler colonialism? So say, for instance, if you're teaching students in business, the basic skill sets or concepts around cultural competence within the racial capitalist logic, it is worthwhile to interrogate what are the infrastructures that are being served by teaching those concepts within a particular framework. Similarly, when we think about the basic idea of competence built upon rational, efficiency-oriented, effectiveness-oriented skill sets, where culture itself has been incorporated into a logic of efficiency, well, that is whiteness. It is the broader value of white culture that sets up efficiency and effectiveness as the ways in which we go about measuring something. And then this third one, and again, I have written about this quite a bit, is the concept of cultural intelligence. The suggestion that we can be culturally intelligent by mapping out and figuring out diverse cultures and then learning to navigate these diverse cultures for utilitarian, instrumentalist gains upholds that infrastructure of whiteness. So when we are becoming culturally intelligent, we are being culturally intelligent to uphold racial capitalism. So think about the workers of tomorrow who are culturally intelligent, serving global organizations, serving as infrastructures for global capital to expand itself, just like the critique I was offering of internationalization as a way for expansion of global capital. So within this context, I want to attend to and draw our attention to a concept called communicative inequality. Communicative inequality refers to inequality in the distribution and ownership of a range of communication resources, from information to representation, to resources for decision-making and representation, to community participation and voice. And I make the argument that when we actually look at intercultural inequality across global spaces, what we fundamentally see are communicative inequalities. And these inequalities then shape cognitive inequalities in terms of who gets to define knowledge and who does not get to define knowledge. So, when in communication, again, the communication so white movement, the hashtag ComSoWhite movement emerged, one of the responses of the dominant structures was to say, well, we will accommodate these different forms of knowledge production. We will include these different forms of knowledge production. But that too leaves power intact in the hands of the hegemonic structures, because the structure decides who it will include, who it will exclude. What are the rules of participation, what are not. So as long as we get to be the good brown person sitting at the table without raising the kinds of questions I'm raising here, we get a seat at the table. We get to participate in the conversation, and we have mobility through the structures because we have played the game of the structure. That is why you will see a proliferation of post-colonial, decolonial scholars who have made careers out of post-colonial, decolonial scholarship have nothing to say on Palestine in the midst of ongoing violence of colonization. It is because we are incentivized systematically to perpetuate these communicative inequalities. So I argue that these communicative inequalities then shape the violence that we experience, that we witness around us across the globe. So violence results from communicative inequality, and violence in turn produces communicative inequality. So if you think about the systemic destruction of universities in Gaza, the targeting of academics in Gaza, these are examples of the ways in which violence itself is used as an instrument to perpetuate communicative inequality. So this kind of communicative inequality then shapes what I theorize in my work as intercultural inequality, the basic idea that some cultures are to be valued while others are to be devalued, or the basic idea that some cultures are progress, modernization, transformation, while others are backward, savage, inhuman. In Aotearoa, we continually see this in the devaluing and pathologization of traditional Maori or indigenous culture. In the contemporary discourse, you see this globally in terms of the ongoing pathologization of Palestinian culture and the Palestinian people. It is the turning of the Palestinian people into less than human, non-human, into animal-like features is what legitimizes an infrastructure of violence that is being carried out in broad daylight. That violates all kinds of principles of international justice, but can be legitimized because Palestinians are not human. They are less than human. Therefore, they do not belong. So intercultural inequality then plays out in two ways. Often it marks certain communities, groups that are targeted as primitive or backward, incapable of civility. So you will see the language of civility often invoked in order to shut down democratic spaces. And the other is the language of terror. You know, whenever there is resistance to this infrastructure, then that thought is framed or labeled as terrorist thought or a dangerous thought. So we see in Aotearoa, New Zealand, a far-right infrastructure of digital hate targeting Maori that frames Maori as dangerous, that frames Maori organizing as dangerous to New Zealand society, that frames decolonization as dangerous. And we have to really ask the question, it is dangerous for whom? It is dangerous for this racial capitalist imperial structure. So this intercultural inequality underlies the broader infrastructure of racial capitalism, cisnormativity, patriarchy, and imperialism. So communication in this sense has historically, including technological platforms that serve as mediated infrastructures of communication, has served as an instrument for the neocolonial powers, particularly in terms of being shaped by global geopolitics and the promotion of global free markets, often in the hands of oligarchs, right? So if you look at platform capital, global, when we talk about technology and transformation and intercultural communication, we need to consider the fact that Meta, X, these are global tech corporations that control most of the tech platforms and therefore the communicative infrastructures in which we participate. So within that sense, what are the kinds of threats that are posed by oligarchs to democracies? Again, we talk about today the Elon Musk vis-a-vis Trump moment, but that doesn't exist in a vacuum as a pathology of Trump vis-a-vis Musk. It exists as an extension and very much as a product of this oligarchic infrastructure of extractive platform capital. So extractive platform capital simultaneously, you see this in the work of Susanna Zuboff in terms of the workings of surveillance, continually surveils us, turning us and our bodies into infrastructures of surveillance, including turning cultures as sites of surveillance as it then deploys this surveillance to carry out marked violence. Now, we have seen this consistently in terms of Palestinian activists pointing out that activists posting on digital platforms stories of Palestine or events happening in Palestine were geotagged, geolocated, their locations figured out, and then targeted with precision technologies to be bombed out or murdered. So you think about the capacity of technologies to be precise is fundamentally built within this architecture of technologies as infrastructures of violence through surveillance. So it is within this backdrop then we see the ongoing epistemicide and erasure of indigenous global south knowledge systems to justify potential genocides, both in terms of material, physical genocides, as well as cultural genocides. Now, this process simultaneously uses colonial divide and rule in order to legitimize its infrastructure, and that's the next concept I will get into. What I mean by that is continually needs to incorporate global south elites for it to function like this. So elite capture is pretty much an important element within this expansive network of cultural digital capital, where post-colonial elites are continually incorporated and co-opted as gatekeepers. So we are co-opted in order to inform the capitalist structure how best to work, how best to operate. So you see a proliferation of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion kinds of jobs that empower and incentivize us pretty much to uphold this infrastructure. So post-colonial elites, we see this in the context of India, for instance, have been invested in perpetuating the colonial divide and rule strategies to uphold elite power. So we see this in the work of Olufemi Tayo, who points out that across global contexts, the elite participate in the ongoing perpetuation of this epistemology of whiteness. So whiteness in this sense, the hegemonic values of white culture that I talked about, needs to be read through these categories of individualism, cognitivism, linearity in communication message centrism, right? The idea that you can effectively communicate only if you figure out the right message. So the work of cultural experts becomes one of extracting the cultural characteristics that can help us design the right message. I have a piece published in 2007 on the cultural sensitivity approaches, where I argue that cultural sensitivity works precisely as a tool to extract the kinds of cultural characteristics that would help make the imperial apparatus, the racial colonial apparatus, even more sophisticated, even more intelligent, because now it can figure out culture, how to best then tailor its messages for the purposes of perpetuating the market. So whiteness needs to be read in terms of its relationship with imperial politics and capitalism. So this is also the work of my colleague, Professor Graham Hingangaroa Smith, one of the founders of Kaupapa Maori theory, and Graham argues that any kind of cultural critique we offer also has to have this kind of structural critique, to understand how structures incorporate culture to uphold power and control. So now coming to the digital infrastructures before we start moving in through some examples. So the digital infrastructure then extends this process of ongoing incorporation of culture for extractive purposes, to organize data, to further entrench capitalist proliferation. Simultaneously, as it does so, we see the proliferation of disinformation and hate. And this is my critique of the literature on platforms and disinformation and hate, on work on, for instance, cognitive processing biases, that will talk about how on Facebook, we see proliferation of disinformation, and we can create some digital literacy so that people are better educated on how to decipher facts from misinformation. That picture, however, fails to recognize the broader notion that the very architecture of platform capital is built upon hate, disenfranchisement, and erasure. That the very logics, the algorithmic logics through which platform capital works, manipulates hate in order to profit from it. So hate in that sense is integral to how these architectures hold up. Simultaneously, we see proliferation of apolitical diversity. So the kind of diversity that will work to the extent that it is palatable to the colonial structure, and we continually then as people of color, as global South people, as indigenous people, train ourselves, so a pedagogy of colonization that we impose upon ourselves to see how we can become the better subject within this structure. So platform moderation within this context also upholds power and control of the hegemonic structure. So it's important to ask who is doing the moderation. If Facebook is doing its own, if Meta is doing its own moderation, as in charge of its own moderation, what is it exactly moderating? And here I invite you to consider the ways in which Meta actually has collaborated with nation states, particularly authoritarian nation states, to take down, stop particular pages, to shadow ban particular pages. So if we think that Meta is where we will reach in terms of empowerment, or the Google balloons that are placed in rural communities is what would hook up these communities into infrastructures of empowerment and enlightenment, we need to critically really think about what is the fundamental incentive structure of platform work. In our own work, what we have seen is platform moderation is often disengaged from communities at the margins. Our work post-Christchurch in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with Muslim communities on trying to develop a basic platform moderation infrastructure that addresses the proliferating Islamophobia online was really largely ineffective because of the power structures that are at work at the national and global level. So it's really interesting because on one hand, you will have Jacinda Ardern talking about the Christchurch call, which sounds also great and progressive, but on the other hand, when it comes to actual experiences of communities, you see systematic, consistent disenfranchisement. So it's really worth asking who has a voice, and can communities have a voice within the context of this broader platform architecture? And simultaneously, we see, as I pointed out, within these platforms, the co-option of decolonization and post-colonial elites to serve this architecture. So you see, for instance, the ways in which the Zionist narrative, or in the Indian context, the Hindutva narrative deploys the language of decolonization in order to further set up and perpetuate this architecture. So in this backdrop, then I want to wrap us up with some hope and talk about the culture-centered approach and what does it mean to work with communities in co-creating spaces of radical democracy, in co-creating structures rooted in redistributive commitments, both to economics and politics. So in this sense, I want to tautoko the work of Professor Linda Tuhuai Smith, Professor Graham Smith, Leonie Pihama, who talks about the work of decolonization actually happens in communities, in struggles. It doesn't happen in our academic journal articles, unfortunately. It doesn't happen in policy reports that we might write up to the hegemonic structures. It doesn't happen within the architectures of the settler colonial state. It has to happen through the work of communities in struggles. So it's worth asking, what does it mean to anchor communication in communities as spaces of struggle within struggles? What does it mean to anchor communication in social movements and activist interventions and in everyday performances that seek to challenge the racial capitalist and imperial structure? I here on the screen have an image posted, and I want to go back to this image. So you see this image from the Bandung conference. How many of you are familiar with the Bandung conference, and the non-aligned movement? The non-aligned movement in the context of the newly emerging states that were coming out of their anti-colonial struggles, having dismantled colonialism and starting to articulate an anti-colonial politics, articulated this idea of non-aligned movement as a space of sovereignty. And within that context, the Bandung movement articulated the concept of New World Information Communication Order, or NWICO. The idea of NWICO was that global South peoples ought to have sovereignty over the communicative infrastructures that operate within these spaces. Going back to the question of ownership, who owns these communicative infrastructures? Well, Bandung was systematically dismantled because of US interventionism into UNESCO. US threatened to move out of UNESCO, and systematically at that point really dismantled UNESCO because it framed UNESCO as becoming too communist and too socialist. But the idea in there was really the idea that Global South communities, Global South peoples ought to have ownership over communication infrastructure. So the culture-centered approach then argues that to actually address communicative inequalities globally within the context of intercultural interactions, we need to think about the ways in which we can build voice infrastructures as spaces through which communities can articulate their voices. So I will first offer you a definition of what I mean by voice infrastructures. These are systems, platforms, norms, and processes through which communities can express their voices, share their stories, and participate in decision-making. Yeah, I will let that sit on the screen a little bit. The idea is quite straightforward, that it is for communities to own those spaces, those processes, those resources through which they can tell their stories, through which they can share their knowledge, through which they can participate in decision-making processes. This is our work in the indigenous context of rural Bengal that CARE has been doing over 2 decades. And this work is built around the concept of learning. This is with an Adivasi community of Santalis. And this is around the work of learning the Santali language in schools and building spaces for learning the Santali language with a very simple notion that language sovereignty over the language is a first step toward cultural sovereignty in intercultural interactions. So remember the intercultural inequality we talked about? So one of the key ingredients in addressing that is in building language sovereignty. And here, this work is really powerful because you see the advisory group of community members that actually holds up this infrastructure are Santali women, you know. So we talk about gendered organizing within this context of indigenous spaces. It also offers powerful exemplars in terms of questions of intersectionality and anti-racist organizing. So a critical concept in that is the concept of communicative sovereignty, the capacities of the colonized to control and own communicative narratives and stories and resources that tell the stories of colonial terror. So we see this in the context of Gaza. You know, one of the powerful things that happened as global media shut down stories of Gaza systematically, these spaces were disrupted through communicative infrastructures at the margins in Gaza, documenting every day the violence, the terror, and the effects of the terror. So this is Bisan Oda, one of the journalists in Gaza. You have seen how, in the context of this conflict, journalists in Gaza played a critical role in sharing stories and sharing information, and really, in that sense, transforming global opinion in the backdrop of and in spite of the propaganda that is constructed within these hegemonic structures.
This is Bissam from Gaza. I am still alive. It's the day 467 of the genocide. It's 6 p.m. Gaza time now, and people here around me are waiting for the ceasefire announcement. I'm near Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. People here are displaced, hopeless, grieving, so tired, and just waiting for any announcement. You need to know before this that this is not the end of the genocide. This is not the end of the war. Israel's war against God.
So these communicative infrastructures become infrastructures for witnessing every day the acts of violence, and through that process, intervening into them. The next concept is the concept of transforming accountability. Voice infrastructures transform accountability from the up toward the communities we live in. So it's not your journal article, it's not your funder who is funding your project, you know, and there is also this idea that communities continuously challenge, which is social change or intercultural communication work seeking justice cannot be funded by the very state capitalist structures that are the perpetrators of this violence. So in that sense, transforming of accountability in terms of organizing communities at the margins as infrastructures that build up and hold up governance systems. And that is the idea of radical democracy, turning democracy into the grassroots. So in the face of the far-right campaign that we are seeing in Aotearoa seeking to dismantle Te Tiriti, again, which is our foundational document, the resistance to that comes from Maori, from Tangata Whenua, within communities. So you see some of the largest protests happening in New Zealand, they're coming from the grassroots, from communities, with communities organizing. Rooted in efforts of collectivization, where these concepts of sovereignty are the basis for articulating collective rights, that are the basis for disrupting both structures of surveillance as well as authoritarian erasures. Anchored in struggles for land. So voice is deeply connected to land. That is what indigenous struggles teach us. But this cannot be just in the form of some paper that we write up where we say, oh, land is one part of spirit, which is part of well-being. It has to be more than that. It actually, going back to the concept of accountability, it actually then calls for us and calls upon us to be in those land struggles when the lands of indigenous people are being taken over and confiscated. So this is the work that we have done with one such land occupation. Anchored in sovereignty. So this is, you saw that land where they were challenging the state's takeover of the land. That is also the land where the Whenua grow food. So it is anchored in notions of sovereignty, but sovereignty of communication, sovereignty of land, connected to sovereignty of food. So here, this is one of our community organizers who is saying that when we collectivize to own our food sources and connect them to ancestral land, so which is also connecting to ancestral knowledge, Wairua, the spirits and the bodies are nourished, hearts are filled, and our minds are sparked with future possibilities and reimagining. So in this context, they talk about healing the trauma by A, resisting the takeover of the land, B, by being connected to, finding ways of connecting to the land, growing the food, doing the things that ancestors used to do. So this is our work with women farmers who are organized into sanghams or collectives in South India with an organization called Deccan Development Society. Here they challenge the neoliberal takeover of agriculture by again turning to indigenous seeds and sovereignty over indigenous seeds as ways in which this takeover can be challenged. And this is in the backdrop of the farmer epidemic, where you have seen large-scale farmer suicides in this part of India particularly. So they suggest that the takeover of these redistributive capacities is also about fundamentally reshaping how we grow food, who owns food, how we share food. So to articulate and materialize a feminist political economy that is also indigenous, that is anti-caste, and that is rooted in the local politics. So regeneration as ownership of knowledge is materially about transforming how we grow food. So I'll just play this song. Here you So singing to the seed becomes a way for reorganizing what it means to build a platform for sharing knowledge and redistributing it, creating affective registers that challenge the racial capitalist logics. And then knowledge in that sense, and sovereignty over it is materially grounded. This is from our latest work. Our community organizers just sent me this video in a Santali village in eastern India, where, as I said, we have these schools that are run by Santali community organizers to teach the language, and here they're celebrating the Hool. The Hool is the first resistance, the Santali resistance to the British, in the form of an acknowledged large-scale mutiny that was led by indigenous people. So the learning of language is also about retelling a story of the past and retelling a story of resistance. So I will wrap up with that. Okay. Well, Jamie is saying I need to wrap up, so I'll just quickly go through the last slides. It's rooted in the body. It centers joy and affective registers of joy. This is the organizing against sort of the far-right conspiracy groups that have targeted Maori sovereignty in Aotearoa, centering love and reimagining democracies by noting that indigenous peoples can teach us how to fundamentally reshape our democracies and democratic structures. Thank you.